He was perhaps the ultimate imposing figure of 20th century music. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky's father was a bass singer in the Kiev Opera, and although he introduced his son to music, he didn't necessarily want the young Igor to go off following in his footsteps. As a kid, he had few friends, and he considered himself an unlikable person. His escape was in music, and he swallowed up piano lessons and got into the inner workings of music theory as he took existing pieces from the repertoire and transcribed them for his instrument. Even though his passion was clearly in music, his parents wanted him to have a steady job. How things don't change. Anyway, he enrolled in the University of St. Petersburg with the intent of studying law to become a lawyer. As you might imagine, this didn't happen. Stravinsky began studies with the elder statesman of Russian music, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, the last surviving member of the group known as the Mighty Handful. Rimsky-Korsakov encouraged Stravinsky to push himself, but the youngster's first pieces, such as Fireworks or the Symphony in E-flat, both for orchestra, show a clear indebtedness to Rimsky's style. Interestingly, Rimsky went on to say that he didn't think Stravinsky had a particularly good ear for orchestral color. Alexander Glazunov, another leading Russian composer, thought that Stravinsky's music wasn't very musical. Stravinsky's big early breakthrough came by way of Sergei Diaghilev, who was the impresario of the Ballet Russe. Now, the Ballet Russe was a touring ballet company from Russia, and much of Europe was completely enamored with the mystery and exoticism and primitivism inherent in Russian culture. The French couldn't get enough of the Russians, oddly enough, and the Russians couldn't get enough of the French. Either way, when Diaghilev came into contact with some of Stravinsky's early orchestral scores, he commissioned him to orchestrate some pieces, such as Chopin piano pieces, so that the Ballet Russe could dance to them. And eventually, he asked Stravinsky to write his own original ballet scores. The success of the first two ballets, Petrushka and The Firebird, led to a third, The Rite of Spring, in 1913. This music was incredibly avant-garde. Stravinsky employed a massive orchestra, the biggest orchestra he would ever use, and one of the biggest orchestras, if not the biggest orchestra, for any ballet score, especially one that's still being done. He used unusual and constantly changing time signatures for a savage rhythmic pulse, something that was equated in the dance with the choreography by Vaslav Nijinsky, who used a decidedly umbilical style to represent the pagan ritual of sacrificing a virgin to the spring god. I know, it's just a wonderful upbeat story. Anyway, all this combined led to an infamous riot at the Parisian premiere, which is sometimes known by inveterate jokesters such as myself as the Rite of Spring. Puns. As elder statesman of French music Camille Saint-Saëns expressed disbelief at the high bassoon solo that opens the work, those who enjoyed it cheered and those who didn't booed. And those two sides ended up engaging in some mighty fisticuffs in the aisles. The net result? The ballet got immense press coverage, and it solidified Stravinsky's place on the international musical map. And Stravinsky decided to cash in on this even further by basically making up stories about how this piece had just come to him fully formed, and he was just the conduit for its expression, when in reality he worked long and hard on it. The piece is actually tightly constructed, and much of its melodic material derives from Russian folk tunes, although he would never admit this. Stravinsky was now based in Paris, and he produced a number of works that drew upon his Russian heritage in a decidedly avant-garde idiom, although none went nearly as far as the Rite. The entire early period of Stravinsky's career can be described as primitivism, which was an outgrowth of a Russian school of thought that was about getting back to the roots of what made Russia, Russia. With the outbreak of World War I, composers had to take stock of where their music was going, and Stravinsky was no exception. A lot of composers, Stravinsky included, had opted for massive orchestras, but now all these orchestras were depleted, and so economy of means was in vogue. And how economical were Stravinsky's means? Try 3 pieces for clarinet. Not even piano, just clarinet. And ask any clarinetist, they're still pretty difficult. After the war ended, Stravinsky took a turn towards pieces that were a little less decidedly forward-looking, abandoning the avant-garde in favor of an embrace of neoclassicism. Now, neoclassicism is actually kind of a misleading term. Neoclassical composers should really be considered more neo-Baroque composers than neoclassical. They really wanted to take a look at these previous techniques and incorporate them into music that they wrote that was decidedly 20th century. They wanted to find a balance between what they were doing and what, say, Bach would have been doing. And this manifested itself probably most famously in pieces like Prokofiev's Classical Symphony, and Prokofiev said that he wanted to write something that Haydn would write if he lived in contemporary times. For Stravinsky, it was a little more forward-looking than this, and you can tell that the music is still kind of spiky and very 20th century. But there are elements of the Neo-Baroque in there that really make the music interesting. Pieces such as the Dumbarton Oaks Concerto, the Concerto for Piano and Wind Instruments, or the Symphony of Psalms, all exemplify this return to neoclassicism. When the Nazis called his music degenerate, Stravinsky came to the United States, where he settled in Los Angeles, not too far from where Arnold Schoenberg lived. Now, Stravinsky was not the easiest person to get along with, and he and Schoenberg had a strained relationship, so they didn't really see each other that often, but it's still pretty cool that these two composers ended up pretty much on the same street. Stravinsky loved his sandwiches dry and his liquor hard, and he threw himself into conducting rehearsals all over the country. Now, Stravinsky was not a great conductor. He wasn't one of these great pianist, composer, conductors like Leonard Bernstein. But the reason that he wasn't a good conductor of others' works was that he really had no sense of interpretation. Stravinsky was great at conducting his own pieces because he wanted to use the orchestra basically as just a tool. If he gave a clarinet solo that was marked piano, he wanted a clarinet solo that was played piano the entire time. The orchestra was simply a means to an end. He did not want any shred of interpretive qualities from any of the players, be it a large orchestra or simply a solo piece. Many of those who didn't like his music saw it as cold, aloof, and unemotional. The last major compositional period of Stravinsky's career saw an embrace of 12-tone and serialist techniques. Ironically, he actually started writing pieces in this style right after Schoenberg died, and his critics were quick to point this out, but it seems to have just been a coincidence. Like everything Stravinsky did, he took the technique and he incorporated it into his own style. Stravinsky's music can be very spiky and gnarled, and the aesthetics of serialism kind of fit right in. Whether or not he was using a tone row, it just didn't seem out of place. Stravinsky's hard partying life eventually caught up to him, and he passed away in 1977, at the age of 81. As a composer, Stravinsky paved the way in a great many areas, although he actually invented very few, if any, techniques. By taking ancient techniques and applying them to modernist harmonic sensibilities, or by taking extant avant-garde theoretical concepts and extrapolating them, he was able to make his mark on pretty much anything he wanted to. Stravinsky also found a way to make a name for himself by diligently arranging and rearranging any piece for any ensemble. Pounding rhythms and unusual, quickly changing time signatures are the hallmarks of Stravinsky's scores, and this manifests in a music that can only be described as possessing a herky-jerky catchiness. Like any great musician, he was equally fascinated with what was going on in the greater artistic world, and he was friends with W.H. Auden and Pablo Picasso. At one function he attended with Picasso, the two got so wasted that they started publicly urinating their way around Venice, until the cops finally showed up and told them politely to go to bed. Stravinsky was not a man without great contradiction. He was an atheist from his teenage years up until the middle of his life, at which point he rejoined Russian Orthodoxy and became a fervent believer. Yet he pretty much constantly cheated on both his first and second wife, including a rumored affair with Coco Chanel. For all his high society status, he was an avowed authoritarian who openly admired dictators such as Mussolini, and was incensed when the Nazis insulted his music. All Stravinsky really seemed to care about was music, and the actual politics behind international affairs didn't matter much. If Mussolini liked his music, he was going to like Mussolini. That's the long and the short of it. When you listen to a Stravinsky piece, it sounds like no other Stravinsky piece, and yet it still retains a distinct Stravinskyan quality. He always looked for something new and fresh and exciting without writing the same piece twice in a row, thus explaining the three major compositional periods that musicologists have identified.